She's on Wall Street. She ends up in a police car on her way escorted to a psych ward.
July 2005. After being released from the psychiatric hospital, Janet speaks with Dr. Lukoff and Dr. Groff for the first time.
I was very, very dissatisfied with the fact that traditional psychiatrists call these states altered states. I see it in a kind of a pejorative term that doesn't reflect, how much respect I have for them. But I was particularly interested in these non-ordinary states that are healing, that are transformative, that are potentially evolutionary, and that also have what we call heuristic value, which is that they can bring absolutely new information about the psyche, about human nature, about the nature of reality.
Expertise has been the intersection of spirituality and mental illness. Terms like spiritual emergency, spiritual crisis, spiritually transformative experience, extraordinary experiences, exceptional experiences, and so on. So there's a variety of terms that have been used in kind of recognition of this overlap between spirituality and mental illness, particularly psychosis. But the term that's actually used in the DSM that would be closest to those is religious or spiritual problem.
August 2005, Janet reaches out to David Oakes and Celia Brown of Mind Freedom to begin establishing a support network.
So in 2005, I had just gotten my master's, but I was starting to pull away from spirituality in the sense of religion, right?
Okay.
I was told when I was the assistant to the pastor of this mega church here that I was going to lose all my friends because I'm starting to have these healing abilities. I wasn't aware of what was happening to me,
Right.
But people were starting to stay away from me at that time, and I didn't know how to handle like all the energies that were coming through me.
My husband and I wished to have a child, but I needed to taper off from my psych meds. Depakote was known to cause birth defects, and so I was referred to the Perinatal and Reproductive Psychiatry Clinical Research Program at Harvard's Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital to discuss my options. Dr. Lee Cohen had conducted the only reliable research at the time on the birth defects linked to psych meds taken by bipolar women during their pregnancy. I was given only two available choices: do not have children, or stay on a medication during the pregnancy proven to produce the least amount of birth defects, which was lithium, the very medication that annihilated my creativity. I ignored them and decided to withdraw slowly from the brain meds under close supervision from a doctor to ensure the best prenatal environment for my baby. The withdrawal from my meds was done too quickly, and after a full work schedule teaching 6 different level English classes and directing a high school musical, I launched into a deep creative mode during that winter break from school, and after a misunderstanding of this creative process, I ended up back in Four Winds Hospital in Katona, New York in 2006. Inside a wakeful dream state lasting 10 days, I'm 1 month pregnant and unable to receive antipsychotics. Jack is born in November, and my hope is that he isn't born with the bipolar gene. I become a stay-at-home mom, completely engrossed in raising my son. I hope I will never have to go into a psychiatric hospital again, and I buy into this bipolar label, convinced these meds are what I need to be well.
So what's different from me that is unlike other people is that I have bipolar disorder. There's been some crazy times, but part of my day requires me taking some pills so that I can kind of keep the symptoms at bay. And that's a good thing. It took me a long time to realize that. Like, I shouldn't have pills for my mental illness. How dare I, take something? Why do I need it? Blah, blah, blah. My birth control. But I feel like what I found in the process is that these kinds of things, they help you control symptoms so that you can live a normal life, which is what I'm all about right now, living a normal, healthy, balanced life. And it's unbelievable because the last 5 years it's been like heaven. Everything's been great. But my last episode was such that I was pregnant and had the episode, and it was pretty bad. I was in the hospital. And but now, years later, it took me a long time to heal from this last episode, but everything's great.
January 2006, Janet returns to Bergen Regional Medical Center with her business partner to meet with the CEO and set the record straight on her misdiagnosis. The CEO requests a proposal to train the hospital staff in spiritual emergency. Janet is invited to speak to Congress with the JED Foundation, but it gets canceled. Janet writes to Congressman Patrick Kennedy. Janet and her business partner issue letters to other congressmen and senators, along with a letter to New Jersey Governor Richard Cody. They also visit a law office to determine if this is worthy of a lawsuit. Press releases are issued to the news. Janet and her business partner are ghosted by the CEO of the hospital after repeated attempts to issue the proposal he requested to train his hospital staff in spiritual emergency. They are exhausted and decide to let it go, yet the dream remains alive. Over the next few years, while Janet steps away from publishing the book and producing the movie, she continues to work behind the scenes, supporting healers and people challenged by spiritual emergency situations. Janet is employed by the YMCA K-5 after-school program, offering her toolbox called You Are Quite a Character.
Often when we think about altered states, people who are labeled with things like schizoaffective and schizophrenia, it's often as Malidoma Patrice, a shaman from South Africa, would refer to this as good news from another realm. So we talk about these experiences sometimes as spiritual emergences, spiritual emergencies, breakdowns, breakthrough. And in Western medicine and Western culture and amongst Western peoples, we're so quick to pathologize those experiences.
I too have been someone who has been labeled and diagnosed and hospitalized involuntarily against my will. I was not given any choice in taking the cocktail of the antipsychotics. I was not, in any way, shape, or form told why I needed them. I just was given them and told to take them. I know that I had several family members accusing me of having a chemical imbalance, that was the main culprit involved with why I'd had, what were considered to be delusions and hallucinations, instead of being able to be spiritually sensitive enough to sense the presence of a higher power. My only issues that I needed to work through were other people's disbelief.
Yes.
Like if I had one person in my life, one family member, one friend say, "Hey, Laura, what you're going through sounds just like, a stage, a very murky and oceanic and confusing, discombobulating stage of a spiritual awakening," I would have been like, oh, I believe that probably a whole lot of our psychiatrists in this world who are so overworked, so overwhelmed with cases, have, their quotas, whatever it be, that keeps them just in perpetual go mode, right? They probably can barely keep up with the new diagnoses and reading all these different papers and all the different, things that are happening, that the progress that's made. I would think that would be a very difficult thing to keep up with. So I would think that it's probably one of the reasons that you see labels like bipolar become so incredibly popular.
In April of 2008, I went off medications completely by myself. It was the best decision of my life.
When did you eventually get yourself hospitalized?
Yeah, it was 10 years after it started, so 2000. Yeah, 2008. I tried to introduce a conversation with the psychiatrists, psychologists, and the psych nurses. I offered explanations and alternative frameworks for my mystical and spiritual experiences. However, these were seen solely through the eyes of psychopathology, through the lens of psychopathology. And in that setting, there was no room for my views and my interpretations. I was given a very dehumanizing clinical gaze as I expressed my experiences, and everything was fit into a very narrow and incorrect box to align with current diagnoses. Everything that I shared, from the depths of my soul, and these are common experiences that are very human, was looked at without any sense that there was a human being speaking. The challenging spiritual experiences are not pathological. They can require care because of their intense nature, but they are to be seen as more complex and definitely not a biomedical or they don't have biomedical origin. So I presented this to my psychiatrist in the hospital and then to my psychologist as an outpatient, and neither of them was willing, even though it was in the DSM, to explore this. That was a dead end.
So we're fast forwarding to my 20s. I'm living in New York at the time. In 2008, during a recession, I'm working several jobs. I'm working 7 days a week. I'm deeply masking pain, and these thoughts have returned, and I'm actually trying to find a way to stay. And one thing before I enter the hospital, I want to say I actually reached out to therapists, and the minute I said suicide, they turned me away. They said, no, you're too far gone. And so I went to a hospital to try to find a way to stay, and they didn't believe me. They thought because I was able to articulate that I was high functioning, that I couldn't be struggling. They thought I was high functioning because I said, I don't want to live here. I need help. And that just underlines to me like the role that racism plays when someone Black tries to get help, when we present differently, or are interpreted as aggressive or articulate. So I was immediately released. I attempted 3 days later, and then I was forced into the hospital. The same hospital I was trying to get help in that didn't believe me. I had to go right back in. And I want to just say that when I went back in, it was because in between that time, I was sexually assaulted by a friend. And I didn't want to be here. I didn't know how to be here. I had to get out. And so when I came back into the hospital, I received the worst treatment I could have ever received. I was over medicated. I had chemical restraints. So they poured all sorts of drugs into me. I couldn't tell up or down, night or day. I had a nurse tell me not to let myself get raped again. I know she looked at me and she said, you're strong. And, as a Black woman hearing you're strong, looking me up and down about my physical body, don't let yourself get raped again. And I am supposed to not react because I want to get out of this hospital, but I'm enraged inside, but I can't display it. And so I think that's another element. But I think that the other wild thing that happened was at one point they were showing Silence of the Lambs in the psychiatric hospital. And I walked up to a nurse and I said, do you think this is an appropriate movie choice for us right now? And she just looked at me like, oh, you are so high functioning. You don't belong here. And I was like, that is not, the takeaway isn't that I'm high functioning, whatever that means. The takeaway is that we're not even people in this place. We're getting babysat by problematic television, traumatized by over medication, and then told harmful things like don't let yourself get raped again. And so I say this, and this isn't even like, there's so many stories like mine. It's not even shocking, even though it really should be, to people like me who've been in hospitals. It's kind of like, what's your hospital war story? Here's mine.
married and divorced. I got divorced and married all in the same year. Trying to get back to church because he's a PK kid. His grandfather opened 3 churches in the Chicagoland area, but I didn't feel comfortable going into the churches because it was very judgmental, because I did have the healing touch, and so did my son, my first son. My first son they call it slaying people. Like, he would touch somebody and somebody would pass out. So I had to start telling my son, you can't touch people, and start being protective of him. He walked up to a person and just gave him a hug. We were all standing. It was my in-laws, and we were all standing together, and Gideon ran to this woman, and I'm like chasing after her, and he hugs her, and she was like, at first she was going to push him away, then she was like, and she bends down, she hugs him. I will never forget this. And she's like, thank you. And he goes, God loves you. Yeah, God loves you. And she starts bawling. And so now I grab my son, and I start walking back to my in-laws. I don't know where she went, but she came back and she met me and my in-laws, and she said, I just wanted to let you know that I was thinking about committing suicide after church. So what your son just did for me.
I had a spiritual emergency, and I could not find any help at the time to help me with my spiritual emergency. Like many of my clients, I also felt trepidation about speaking with a helping professional regarding the experiences I had had, which had include visions, had include audio communication, a lot of mystical experiences I had in this acute period of time, and I did not feel safe or comfortable having conversations with a helping professional regarding these experiences.
Well, I would consider it a spiritual emergence in 2011 that turned into a spiritual emergency due to the traumatic contact that I had with the mental health system.
Janet's son Brandon enlists in the U.S. Army following high school graduation.
The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a few provisions that I think are really applicable here. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Everyone has the right to an effective remedy by the competent national tribunals for acts violating the fundamental rights granted to him by the Constitution or by law. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought. Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression.
I had begun to hear stories of people who, even if given what might seem like a mild label, were nevertheless now classified as mentally disordered and therefore had lost custody of their children, lost jobs, lost their health insurance, lost the right to make decisions about their medical and legal affairs, and more. In late June and early July 2012, 9 of us filed complaints with the APA Ethics Department. 7 filed because they were harmed by getting a diagnosis, and an 8th filed because a loved one died as a result of being diagnosed. I filed an interested party complaint after decades of calling in vain for any DSM or APA official vigorously to educate the public about the unscientific nature of the manuals and to redress the harm and prevent future harm. People who've been diagnosed have suffered the most. Others who have suffered include their loved ones and a whole country, in fact, many countries, as the DSM has gone global, were too much consumed with calling every kind of suffering mental disorder, with all of the damaging consequences and almost nothing helpful to follow from that. There's a troubling rush to call everyone who's been devastated by war mentally ill. Why no public education campaign like there is about the negative effects of drugs? Why aren't they, like the drug companies, required to keep records of and publicly report the harm, redress past harm, and reduce it in the future? Those with whom I worked on the complaints, some people call us the DSM-9, found their voices and bravely asked the APA Ethics Department to consider their pleas. They had turned to the mental health system in the first place because they were suffering and reasonably expected help. Instead, their lives were in many ways destroyed, some forever. Others had intended to file complaints but became too afraid to continue. So damaging had the DSM system been to them, and they rightly feared retribution. Some who filed complaints struggled mightily when writing their stories because it had been horrific to recall the calamities that resulted from getting DSM labels. But even they found that having the chance to speak the truth and ask that those who were the first cause of the harm done to them finally be held accountable had been the first good thing to come from their nightmarish times. Like them, I hope the APA Ethics Department would take steps to repair what's been damaged and prevent future harm.
Of a woman who has asked to be called Davina for this video. She is one of the people who filed complaints with the American Psychiatric Association's Ethics Department because of the harm she suffered from being diagnosed with labels from their manual, known as the DSM. All of the complaints were summarily dismissed without consideration of their merits. Quote, I'm a 40-year-old woman who was diagnosed with schizophrenia and then bipolar 1 disorder when I was 23 years old, from May until October of 1996, and the harm I suffered as a result continued until 2008, when it began to lessen because of my own actions. I feel like I went through a Holocaust. Some people believe doctors 100%, even more than their own judgment or intuition, most likely because of the impression that the DSM and the drug treatments represent some scientific truth and proven effectiveness. But, fact, no scientific evidence has verified any mental disorder as a physical condition. I was wrong to put my faith in doctors and ignore my instincts. The harm from being diagnosed disrupted more than 15 years of my life, cost my family and me hundreds of thousands of dollars, cost me relationships and jobs due to my inability to work. I came near death many times, and the emotional distress and pain cannot ever be compensated by monetary damages. It destroyed my livelihood and the most productive years of my life. Currently, I have multiple consulting jobs, including helping some of the doctors at the institution that diagnosed me over 15 years ago. I feel they need as much help as possible, as do the people they are still diagnosing daily with DSM disorders.
So after I published Anatomy of an Epidemic, I began hearing from people who really wanted to sort of talk about what it meant for them, and both from people with lived experience and prescribers, actually. Now, at that time, I already had a personal blog because Mad in America was my first book, and so I had a blog related to that. And so I began just running their blogs on my personal blog. And then it became obvious that really, it would be really helpful to have a website that did several things. Provided a forum for people with lived experience to talk about their experiences, to provide a forum for people just to write about what were their thoughts about how we might change psychiatry, prescribers, family members, activists, that sort of thing. And then 3, of course, is if you look at Anatomy of an Epidemic, it's really a story about how we as a society have organized ourselves around a false narrative of science. And so one of the key things in terms of reforming psychiatry or rethinking psychiatry is to provide the actual research to the community, to the public, about what is known about drugs, what is known about the validity of diagnoses and that sort of thing. So it became evident that it would be really useful to have a website that provided those three things: a forum for stories of personal experiencing, a story for blogs, and research news.
How he has taken all of these years of experience that he's had, and in establishing Mad in America, and all the all the chapters that are now around the world, you know. And I was there. I attended the sessions for Mad in Ireland, and the recent ones, and to see how it's flourishing, how this movement that he started under Mad in America is flourishing in so many other places now, because the truth is coming out, and we're sensing the truth of what he says, and we're sensing but it's not truth in a battle truth. It's a truth in a compassionate way, as you said, and it's the kind of truth that you go, yes, now what?
My name is Nadine Denneth. I'm from the UK, and all my experience in the field of mental health has come from seeing what has happened to two family members of mine who have both been sectioned under the Mental Health Act 1983 for treatment of their bipolar disorder. So I'll be speaking about one of those family members. That's my dad. I don't have permission to speak about the second family member, but what I will say is that they have been signed off work for life. The family's request, we asked for the antipsychotic to be stopped. We believed that the antipsychotic was contributing to his decline, but the sodium valproate that was started in the first hospital was continued. And as a result of him being in a nursing home care setting where the care home staff were ensuring compliance with the medication, his cognitive state worsened. So, you know, when he was at home, it was possible for him to not take his medication, but now when he's in an institution, and it's, you know, the care home staff are ensuring that the medication regime is upheld, this coincided with quite a decline in his cognitive state. So just to give you an example, my dad was no longer able to get out of bed. He was now living in a bed 24 hours a day. He couldn't hold a knife and fork, so he was needing to be spoon-fed. He couldn't now open his eyes or make or sustain conversation. My mum suggested to me that she was going to go to a conference that was being hosted by Dr. James Davies on behalf of the Council for Evidence-Based Psychiatry. Now, I'd never heard of CEP at this point, and I was curious to see what would be happening at this conference, so I went with her. When I went to that conference, I was blown away by hearing the number of people who were giving testimony of their experiences on antipsychotic medication, antidepressant medication, and how their lives had been turned upside down as a result of taking the medications that they were being prescribed. And we were hearing about how mental health disorders were formulated, how there was no scientific basis for them, and that a treatment could be given to someone where people were not necessarily getting better, yet they were actually getting worse in a lot of cases. And I was just in disbelief as to how this could be A, allowed, and B, why were we not doing anything to stop this from happening to so many people? You know, and my dad was now one of these people who were drastically, their lives have been drastically affected as a result of this medication that was being given to them. So I left that conference really charged to wanting to do something, you know, and I decided that I would write a formal complaint to the hospital where my dad was sectioned 3 years earlier. I then made an appointment with my dad's community psychiatrist to discuss his current medication. Like I said, he was still on sodium valproate, although he wasn't on an antipsychotic at that point. And I pleaded with the psychiatrist to begin withdrawing that drug. Now, because I had the lasting power of attorney for health and welfare, the psychiatrist listened, and I do believe having that lasting power of attorney really helped them to at least be open to listening and taking on board my comments. Now, after that sodium valproate had been reduced to 0, my dad started to improve significantly. And it was such an improvement that the nursing home staff began calling his recovery a miracle. Now, my dad was, like I said before, just eating, when we were helping him to eat, he'd only be able to have spoonfuls of food. He was now able to eat full-blown meals, so he would be asking me to go and get him takeaway. He was laughing and joking, he could make and sustain conversation. It was an amazing improvement, and I was just so happy to see him come back to life. And I remember asking my dad, what do you remember when you were in this state? What were your memories? And he said to me, Nad, it was like I was lost in a dark hole and someone came to pull me out. And I'll never forget those words. I wrote a second complaint to the hospital outlining the improvements that my dad had made since the medications had been withdrawn. And I received a dismissive response telling me that the Alzheimer's was the working diagnosis and that I should familiarise myself with the impact this can have on a person's life. And if I needed to speak to a dementia nurse, they'd be more than happy to put me in touch with them. So there was no real appreciation of what I had written and actually acknowledging the fact that my dad had improved and how was it possible for someone to improve from having a diagnosis of dementia, which is supposed to be deteriorative. So within 6 months of my dad improving, the psychiatrist, the community psychiatrist that my dad was under, noted in his medical notes that it was remarkable how much improvement had been maintained. And it was at one of those networking events that I met a barrister, and I told him the story about what happened to my dad and how he'd improved after the medication being withdrawn. And my barrister friend guided me on the next steps that I should be taking over the next few months to ensure that legal action could be taken. Now, I had no idea about whether there was even a chance of anything happening to get justice for my father, but this barrister friend of mine suggested that I write to the Parliamentary Health Service Ombudsman, who investigate complaints on behalf of the NHS. So I did that, and I received a letter back from them, and they said they wouldn't take any further action, and I didn't know what that meant. What do I do now? And I phoned them, and they said to me that I'd need to take legal advice. So that would obviously involve me needing to instruct a solicitor. So I approached various solicitors. I told them briefly what had happened to my father and how he'd improved after the medications had been withdrawn, and how the working diagnosis was Alzheimer's disease, but it didn't seem to be actually the cause of why my dad had declined so significantly in physicality and in his cognitive function. And they were quoting to me case law to explain why I wouldn't have a case for my father. And the case law they were quoting me was the Bolam versus Frian Hospital Management Committee in 1957, because the Bolam test from which that case law comes from is where a doctor is not guilty of negligence if they've acted in accordance with a practice accepted as proper by a responsible body of medical men that are skilled in that particular art. So basically what they were saying was that any doctor would have done what the psychiatrist had done in my dad's case. So I just didn't know what to do at this stage. Does that mean that there was no chance? So I spoke to the barrister friend of mine, and he told me not to give up and directed me to a scheme in the UK known as the Public Access Scheme or Direct Access Scheme, where you can instruct a barrister from your own private funds. So I had a free consultation with the barrister that I decided to call, who was skilled in clinical negligence, and after a 20-minute free consultation with that barrister, I heard the words, "I think you have a case." And 2 letters of claim were drafted by the barrister that I'd instructed, and they identified 38 breaches of care from the medical staff that my dad was under the care of in those 2 hospitals that I had mentioned. And once finalised, those letters of claim were sent to the NHS Litigation Authority for response. Now, 6 months after posting those letters of claim, NHS Resolution admitted liability. So they admitted that they had administered too large a dose, or the hospitals involved had administered too large a dose of the antipsychotic medication, that they had failed to reduce the dose of the antipsychotic medication or to change the medication as the symptoms of extrapyramidal symptoms had began, or EPS had began. This is obviously to do with how he was now unsteady on his feet and unable to keep his gait in a line. So they decided also that they admitted liability in the fact that they hadn't changed the antipsychotic for one with a lower risk of EPS. So they actually were saying that the antipsychotic that was given in the second hospital was actually providing an even higher risk of EPS, and that they'd continue to prescribe it. So although these admissions had been put in writing, we were now being asked to prove with expert medical evidence what contribution these breaches of duty of care had on my dad's health in the long term. Finding two experts to comment on these areas, and one was a psychiatrist expert and one was a neurologist. And it was the consultant neurologist who had to prepare a condition and prognosis report, which stated in their report that drug-related impairment of mobility and sedation have contributed to the current physical dependence and impaired quality of life that my dad had experienced. And they went further to say, I would therefore estimate that neuroleptic-induced extrapyramidal symptoms or problems had made a 90% contribution to the deterioration he experienced in hospital between late 2012 and his discharge in February 2013, and a 60% contribution between his discharge in February 2013 and the withdrawal of the drug in October 2013. So this obviously relates to the two hospital admissions that I mentioned. Now, what really hurt me and made me so upset was how the last sentence read that his life expectancy is likely to be reduced by his immobility much more than it is by his presumed Alzheimer's disease. So the consultant neurologist had basically been able to assess that my dad his impairment was caused as a result of the drugs given as opposed to the working diagnosis which the hospitals were using to explain his decline.
After another misunderstanding about my creative process, I'm brought to the hospital again. In the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, I was having difficulty sleeping. And this was the most hurtful of hospitalizations yet because it marked the beginning of the end of my marriage. I'm back at Four Winds Hospital and still on Lamictal.
This is from Joel Paris at McGill University in 2012. He says, while in principle, science should be the basis of any diagnostic system, DSM has been seduced by the illusion that advances in neuroscience provide empirical validity for a new system. In reality, we do not know whether conditions like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or obsessive-compulsive disorder are true diseases.
I was struck personally with, first of all, he confirmed everything that we've been talking about for both the film as well as for the Mad Hatter Summit. That the current reality isn't working, that the medication, but what he did was he put history behind it in terms of research in the historical version, in terms of what happened up until in 1982, what had happened prior, which put a context around it, which I hadn't had before. And what he again confirmed, which I had, but he did it in much better detail, is what's happening today. in Norway, and especially in Norway and Finland. And the Norwegian one really struck me because, again, like all of these movements, they're patient-led. And that he was, again, it was in the confirmation that this construct of disease and this construct of the DSM and this construct of diagnosis is a construct. It's not evidence-based.
With each passing day, I saw the negation of my freedom as an American, as if I was the perfect example of a person who they should lock up with no trial. This bipolar label they tagged me with decades ago, one of the most acute mental illnesses that is classified in the DSM, was linked up to as many aspects of my life as my social security number. After another forced hospitalization, I start my Not As Crazy As You Think blog to begin to share these coercive experiences with the institution.
Janet is employed as director of the Conference Center and Business Development. Janet takes a 2-week timeout to record her story in 2015.
No one would ever really know that I live with sadness and pain and anxiety. Some might call it depression. Sometimes I do slip into that. But most wouldn't know because I have been this success out there. I really want to talk about my spiritual emergencies starting in 1979. I want to find a way to shine the light on it and feel good about it. Yesterday I just cried tears driving home from work. Just tapping into the depth of pain that just can hardly be described. I found myself saying, I didn't do anything wrong. I really didn't do anything wrong. I didn't commit a crime. I got locked up twice, actually 3 times. The first time was just overnight and my dad rescued me. He believed in me.
Janet's son Brandon returns home after his second Afghanistan tour.
I had a very profound experience that completely transformed my life. What happened is I went to bed one night on February the 19th, 2016, fell asleep, had a very, very profound lucid dream. And the next morning when I woke up, I was flooded, when I opened my eyes and I looked around the room, I was flooded with this incredible sense of unity, of oneness, of complete interconnection with the universe, something that I had never had even a glimpse of before in my life. It was a very profound and powerful moment for me. And I was filled with this incredible sense of unconditional love. Again, a love that I'd never experienced in my life, despite having been brought up in a very loving family, surrounded by love. It was something completely different.
I was hospitalized 6 times involuntarily against my will. Smacked the label of bipolar 1 on me, which led to all sorts of trauma and pain. And when I was hospitalized, there was very little to no exploration of the spiritual dimensions of my experience. Initially, I was diagnosed with substance-induced psychosis, then schizoaffective, then bipolar 1, then bipolar 2, and then I just stopped paying attention to the labels. I had 6 involuntary psychiatric hospitalizations. My psychiatrist was telling me, "You've got a lifelong incurable disability. Sorry. You may want to lower your expectations about what's possible." My whole experience was completely spiritual. I told my psychiatrist that I believed God would be able to heal me without medication. And my psychiatrist replied, "God invented the medication and empowered scientists' minds to help you." I was in seminary at the time, so I had a ton of spiritual conversations, and I was plugged into a spiritual direction program. I gained enough conceptual frameworks, existential coping skills, and authentic community to allow me to lean on them when I needed them. I also discovered a powerful meaning and purpose that connected me to a world beyond myself. I started working as a peer support specialist and presenter with NAMI in 2016.
And these mental institutions did not understand either what I was going through. They had a very reductive way of looking at my process. For them, it was brain chemistry unbalance, and it had to be medicated. And they had absolutely no knowledge whatsoever about the traumas, the fears that I was processing. I also would have loved to know that I was not only processing my own traumas, but and my own irrationality, but in many aspects, I was also processing traumas from society and irrational way of thinking that are deep-rooted in our social structures. I didn't have that. And I was lucky I made it on the other side, because I think a lot of people without that understanding really come to believe that they are chronically mentally ill and end up spending their life on medication. And I think this is absolutely dramatic and a consequence of these reductive, materialist ways of looking at human beings and their psychology.
She cannot trust the institution, nor can she trust her parents. Patient states that she only feels safe, and this is in quotes, with my God. MD points out that the emergency room staff were so concerned that Child Protective Services was contacted, although the case was not picked up. So how is that, like, literally in my records right after I speak about God? And this was in 2017, and it goes way back, my history, from 1994, when I was first in the hospital coming back from this spiritual experience. And I told them that I was called to India by God. That's why I was there on this trip. And they were just going on and on about saying that I was delusional. So yes, she said, it says this, the patient stated that she was Jesus and has a computer-like mind and can see very well inside people's minds and hearts. She can hear things without being told. So I was trying to explain what I was experiencing, this very deep mystical experience. And as they were recording all this, it was just like one point after another that they recorded that proved that I had a psychiatric disorder. My medical records further stated I was exhibiting delusional thoughts with convoluted insight because I kept trying to communicate that I was a director of a play and that a lot of people were counting on me and that my absence would affect them. They recorded this as evidence that I was grandiose. These are all symptoms attached to their tag of bipolar disorder. After this aggressive forced hospitalization, I reached out to Mothers Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, and Mind Freedom International. Mind Freedom International Secretary responds, as David Oakes said, even if we won a $1 million grant from Amnesty International or some other organization tomorrow and used it to hire and train a half-dozen smart attorneys, we would still not have the resources to deal with the tsunami of psychiatric victims who approach us for legal assistance or sanctuaries for those fleeing from psychiatric harm and involuntary treatment. And then after that, I wrote up the article, but it was on my site. And then I sent Robert the article about what I wrote up about the seminar that I witnessed. And then at that point, he asked me to write my personal story for Man in America. Wow. So it was very I have to get my voice out there, That was where I was at 2019. And 2018, I also that was my last time I was hospitalized. It was 2017 going into 2018. So it was almost like a decision.
I was writing for Conscious Community Magazine in 2017. That's when I started writing for Conscious Community Magazine about full moons. I was starting to have full moon ceremonies at my house. I was starting to feel a little comfortable to let this spirituality shine a little bit, right? I started using the name Maija because my supervisor tells me that the Lord told her that she had to let me go because I wasn't the type of Christian that should be working with her. She would question all my work, but I just had a perfect score in 2017, in November of 2017. So it didn't sound right that all of a sudden now she doesn't want me to be around. So I sued FDIC on 4 counts of harassment. I was having a total breakdown. I thought I was having a heart attack. They took me to the hospital and they're like, you're having an anxiety attack.
2005, Kenneth Kindler, he was one of the world's researchers. He says about this whole chemical imbalance story, we have hunted for big, simple neurochemical explanations for psychiatric disorders, and we have not found them. Half a century of research has disproven these hypotheses. We organized ourselves around a narrative that told us that the pathology of schizophrenia, the pathology of the causes of schizophrenia, the causes of depression, and really other disorders were due to chemical imbalances in the brain. And that's a story that tells you need to take your medication, and you need to take it forever, really, because you have to counterbalance this thing. And the tragedy is, it's not true. And your science was supported. You know what they said? Oh yeah, we knew this 25 years ago. But clearly they forgot to tell the public because surveys found in 2005, 2007, even more recently, 80 to 85% of the public now knows that psychiatric disorders are due to chemical imbalances in the brain. So that's the heart of the problem we've had. We organized ourselves around a false narrative DSM diagnoses are not useful for research because of their lack of validity. In reality, we do not know whether conditions like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or obsessive-compulsive disorder are true diseases. Study as far as bipolar, it is now well recognized that outcomes today are much worse than in the pre-lithium era.
Clearly articulated as a must-do is policy innovation across domains. This isn't a health issue only where we need policy changes in health and mental health. We need policy changes in housing. We need policy changes in economic development. We need policy. These are all supporting policy changes that say people need the opportunity of wellness. And for me, the individuals that he cites in the studies are the canaries in the mine shaft. They're the ones that have had breakthrough, whatever we want to call it, a spiritual emergence, whatever we want to, and again, don't want to label it either, because we don't want to go from labeling one thing to start labeling another. But they've had some kind of breakthrough. After experiencing what I've been experiencing with Cameron, helping in the space in between.
Yes. Oh,
you know, because that's exactly where he's at. He's searching, he's inside, he wants to find ways of expressing, and he goes to a party Saturday night and police show up at the door 2 hours later because he was acting weird.
Yeah.
Wasn't aggressive. He wasn't doing anything. He was just expressing things that he was experiencing. And so it is in the safe zones of those places in between where you can feel you are loved, and he can have that at home, but that's the problem. He has it at home, and now he needs to find it elsewhere. And it's how do we nurture those spaces where it feels, because once you've been traumatized by the system, you don't trust anybody. You don't want to talk to anybody, especially experts, because they could very well put you away.
My mother was a nurse. This was another cultural factor. She was very supportive of the biomedical model because that's how she was trained. So she did push the medication on me, which I did not want at all. I also came from a family of immigrants. My parents were immigrants from Greece in the 1960s, and my dad was a refugee from China in the 40s during World War II when he was a 4-year-old. There's no doubt that these traumas from the wars they witnessed as children were passed on to me.
There was plenty of things talked about, my mother was reading the book like We Don't Die, and I'm thinking like, Ma, that's the same thing. Exactly. Right. Because it's too fantastical, but again, why? Because it's not talked about, it's not normalized. It's like now all of a sudden my mother's seeing and hearing all these people that I am interviewing. Oh yeah, this one's involved with this too, and this also happened to this person. Oh really? Like now she can make space for it because it exists. It's something real. She doesn't want to be thought of as crazy. Her daughter's crazy already. Like if you go too far into believing your crazy daughter, then you're going to be crazy too. You know what I mean? Like this is the path that a lot of families go down, and it's tragic. And
it's such a huge betrayal that it's hard, and the cognitive dissonance that would arise from physicians, from the APA.
Janet is hosted on Princeton TV with Mariah Media.
The book has an impact for adults and youth. I just see it as a possibility for us to create a dialogue with different groups of people that normally wouldn't come together.
Janet notices a nudge to get back into research on spiritual emergency and meets Elizabeth Sabat and Dr. Michael Garbe through the American Center for the Integration of Spiritually Transformative Experiences, known as ACISTE, ASSIST.
49% of Americans have reported having a significant spiritual or religious experience that changed their worldview, that changed them. That's a significant number. That's a significant number of people that have never talked about their experiences because they're afraid of being ridiculed or shamed or having the sacredness of their experience taken away from them. Very often, they're very difficult to describe, and when you do try to describe these experiences, you cannot convey the actual experience.
First go around at a doctorate, and still trying to integrate these experiences that I had. I wanted my doctorate, the topic of the research, to be on spiritual emergence and spiritual emergency. And when I was bringing in this topic into my research class, I was not met with very welcoming arms. And I was almost in an indirect way, well, actually not even indirect, very direct. I was told, can I not bring in something else to research? And that just goes to show you that the institutions are not very open, or they were not open to this conversation. So I didn't feel like the helping professions could help me. And then clearly the educational institutions were not going to help me do the research. I started doing my practice on my own. And years later, I went back to my second doctorate program. And this time, serendipitously enough, I proposed my research and I was welcomed to do it. And I conducted my research on spiritual emergency, and it was very validating. It was very validating to be allowed to conduct this research. As if we need to be allowed, we have to be given permission to conduct research on spirituality. Because I wasn't offered the support, or because I was not offered the support that I needed, or the welcoming that I needed, I, like many other clients, I started thinking that I was crazy, and that's the problem, right? Because there's no venue of conversation, because this hasn't been normalized, because it isn't okay to talk about this topic. You start thinking there's something wrong with you, and I think that's the problem. Is that myself and many of my clients, because there isn't a welcoming conversation on this topic, you feel isolated, you feel alone, and you feel like you're crazy even without anybody telling you you're crazy.
Dr. Michael Garbe records Janet's story at Rutgers University.
I was fighting FDIC, and it was just too hard for me, and I was contemplating on taking my life. I just couldn't do it. I just didn't want to be here, and I was so depressed that my doctor, who was awesome at the time, Dr. Shushnickel, she said, you need to be hospitalized. And so I went to the hospital. I was splitting too. What I mean by, I was fully disassociating. Yeah, they labeled me as MMD, which was manic, severe manic depression. They labeled me as anxiety. I had general anxiety, and then the DID, which is dissociative identity disorder. When I went to the hospital, I met this wonderful therapist who challenged me. And she said, well, what's next for you? And she goes, the homework that you have to do this weekend is figure out what you're gonna do next. She's like, you're a great coach. I saw your website and you're not doing it anymore. why don't you think of being a therapist? I applied at Northwestern because when I went for my bachelor's degree, Northwestern denied me. So I was like, this lady doesn't know what she's talking about. She thinks I could just, become a therapist or yada, yada, yada. I'm gonna apply at Northwestern. Splitting. So sometimes I would come in, they said, and look completely different. And other times I would come in and I was myself. If I was myself, I was extremely depressed and was quiet. But when I came in as Elohim or as Fifi, they knew who it was. So fast forward to when I graduated. Northwestern. I'm looking
Can I just ask you a question about the hospitalization?
Yeah.
Did they label you with anything for these?
Yeah, they labeled me as MMD, which was manic, severe manic depression. They labeled me as anxiety. I had general anxiety, and then the DID, which is dissociative identity disorder.
And what meds? And what meds were you put on?
I had 7 different meds. I can get. I was on 7.
Write it up. No, because the meds
that you can give to us. Yeah.
Thank you.
I had 7
Was
different
there
meds.
any spiritual part when you were going through that? Like, could you describe there was also a spiritual component in your consciousness? Yeah.
So I was having a walk-in. I just didn't. Now I know it's called a walk-in. I didn't know what that was before. So my husband and friends and other people would tell me that that I looked different. All of a sudden, my face would change, and I would speak in things. I wrote my first book under this time, but at the time I didn't know that it was a channeled kind of book. The conglomerate that works with me is called Elohim, and I call him El. I would, but at the retreat, at the hospital, I was at Linden Oaks. I was challenged to go to school. I went to school. I got accepted. Got out of the hospital. I was still on meds for a little bit. And while I was in school, I was being challenged to be my authentic self. I was like, how can I be a therapist and ask people to if I don't know if I won't be myself? And that's when I started to really accept that I channel a conglomerate. Some people call them the cabinet, some people call them the council, the great council. I had to accept that I can channel this galactic council.
In order to involuntarily commit someone, which is a euphemism for psychiatric imprisonment, the state has to prove by clear and convincing evidence that as a result of mental illness, the person is a danger of serious harm to himself or themselves or others, or so disabled that they are unable to survive safely in freedom. And even if so, they have to prove that there's no less restrictive alternative. For forced drugging, the state has to prove that the person is incompetent to decline the medication, which is a farce all in itself, and that the psychiatric drugs are in their best interest and there's no less intrusive alternative available.
The year I started litigation was in 2019 for the restoration of my firearm rights. I followed this with misfiling in over 20 governmental agencies before filing a civil lawsuit because I really didn't know any better. So, have I gone to court? Yes, I've gone to court. I've gone to court starting in 2019. I'm waiting for a hearing date in the district court to hear the motion for reconsideration, and I'm waiting for SCOTUS to determine if they will hear my state asylum case. So yeah, she should not be put in an asylum or a psychiatric ward for a physical injury.
Just recognize how dangerous mental health laws have become, how off the rails the practice of involuntary commitment actually already is, and we gotta, even if you're not an abolitionist, even if you're not gonna go that far, recognize we are far, far off of where we need to be as a society in terms of what involuntary commitment should really look like, and I'd say break it down into the two pieces because they're very different. The notion of when you're trying to justify detaining someone, physically controlling them, because that's one thing. And then the notion of intervening in someone's brain with drugs or electroshock or whatever it is.
Are already a priestess, and you need to acknowledge who you are, because your gifts are based on your ancestors. And I was like, what are you talking about? And I was like, I'm from Haiti. I don't know nothing like that, because whenever you say Haitian, the minute you think voodoo, right? And I was like, I don't know nothing about voodoo. Like, I'm not. MetLife agreed and approved.
Wow.
And I won my first case. It was 4 cases I did, but I won that first case. Once I won that case, everything else opened up. We got to be realistic about finances, but when God puts it together, it'll work it all out. When I went through my dark night of fighting FDIC, I kind of paused with coaching other people because I was doing my battle. And then when I won my case fully, I started with Soul Ascending.
What I didn't know or realize about the world of psychiatry until long after I exited it, really recently, is that there's a kind of silent contract that you sign when you become a patient of psychiatry. I know not everybody's going to believe this, but I know that I ended up in the hospital 3 separate times because of side effects from these meds.
The numbers of people getting forcibly hospitalized and forcibly treated has actually been rising dramatically for decades. In British Columbia, doubling. In Ontario, doubling. In California, 30-day detentions tripled. Child detainees tripled. In Colorado, doubling. Nevada, doubling. Indiana, doubling. Florida, doubling.
Now, the case settled out of court, and then less than 1 month later, my dad passed away.
I think I've been able to build a good reputation and a career in psychiatry as part of the system. So maybe the system might listen to me with some of these messages. So I would like you, with all of this work you're doing and your dedication and what you're trying to do, to tell me as the American Psychiatric Association, as if I'm all of the psychiatrists in the country, what is the message you really want us to hear?
For sure. So one is, let's just be a lot more honest here about what's really going on with everybody all the time. Like, talk more honestly about the questionable underpinnings of this as a science and be more transparent about it as in its finest, perhaps, an art, and at its most dangerous, perhaps, misinformation and deception and lying and manipulation.
The Buddhists say you have 10,000 sufferings and 10,000 joys, every human being. Well, we want to decrease the power of the sufferings, and we want to extend and expand the power of the joys. And that's why we use these tools.
And it seems to be the case that these tools are lifelong. If you understand them and you start implementing them, they can change your life.
So those would be states that, for example, the shamans experience as part of the initiatory crisis, or states that native cultures experience in rites of passage or some other powerful rituals, the kind of states that the initiates experience in ancient mysteries of death and rebirth in Egypt, in Greece, and other places. The experiences that people have in different forms of yoga, in different forms of Buddhism, the Sufis experience, the Christian mystics, the Kabbalists, and so on. And it was just unbelievable to me that we don't have a special name for them. We put everything into that one bag of altered states, and the implication is that they are all pathological. You see, we don't have a category, a spiritual experience, a mystical experience. So anybody who has any kind of episode of non-ordinary states would be seen as mentally ill and would be getting medication and a diagnosis and so on. So when we did a lot of work with these states and we discovered the healing and the transformative potential, we started calling these spontaneous states spiritual emergencies or psychospiritual crises.
So over the past 2 decades, these people with all these spiritual experiences, 4-star in meds, what happened to them? And they were stigmatized. Where'd they go?
Well, we have to go back to the 70s, 80s, and 90s to answer that question.